So 20 years ago, there was very little regard given to patient-reported outcomes. Now it's pretty much a requirement of any new clinical trial to collect patient-reported outcomes. It's not just a number you're looking to improve. You're looking to improve well-being of subjects on trial. I'd almost go so far as to say that a clinical trial these days without any patient-reported outcomes would struggle to get up.
Welcome to Beyond the Count. I'm founder and CEO of ITP Australia and New Zealand and your host, Danielle Boyle. This is a space created for the ITP community by the ITP community, where we share real stories, expert insights and everything in between. Whether you're living with immune thrombocytopenia, supporting someone who is, or just curious about what life looks like beyond the bruises and the blood tests, you're in the right place. So whether you're driving, out for a walk, folding the laundry, or just sitting back and tuning in, let's dive in and go beyond the count. Today, we are answering some of the most common questions we hear in the ITP community. What are clinical trials, and should I consider joining one? If you are living with immune thrombocytopenia, you may have come across clinical trials while exploring treatment options, or your haematologist may have suggested one to you. For many patients, clinical trials can feel confusing, overwhelming, and sometimes a little bit daunting. So today, we're going to break it all down. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Bird, and together we will walk through clinical trials, how they work, what participation actually looks like, and key things you need to consider before making a decision to participate. We also talk about the realities, things like time commitments, the risks, and how to know if a clinical trial is right for you. So let's dive in. Oh, thanks, Rob, for joining us today. We're talking about clinical trials.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to join you again.
Now, last time we caught up, we talked about ITP and blood clots. So, I thought that it would be a really good transition to do a sort of a basics 101 on clinical trials, because there are so many clinical trials available at the moment, and the pipeline just keeps extending and extending.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. What is it a clinical trial, and why are they so important?
Yeah, well, basically, clinical trials are used to really investigate new drugs which have shown some promise in treatment of specific diseases. So obviously, they're conducted across a whole range of diseases. These days, it's more common to be using a drug that's actually been designed to target a specific pathway or a specific target. So you've probably got a bit higher level of confidence in the fact the drugs may work than it would have done, say, 20 or 30 years ago, where most of the new drugs were derived from products in nature, say, and it really was a sort of a more of a just a try and see approach. So clinical trials are, conducted all over the world. Typically, these days, most clinical trials we participate in are international multi-site trials, and, we contribute to those. In a relatively rare condition like ITP, it's important that you have international trials so that you can have enough people on the trial to develop some meaningful conclusions. So for example, in ITP, a trial comparing two groups of 100 patients is pretty good numbers for ITP, whereas in treatment of things like high blood pressure or heart disease, you'd be looking at 20, 30,000 patients in both arms. So it's important in ITP that we have international trials, as I say, just to make sure we do get enough patients included on those trials as subjects to make meaningful conclusions.
So with clinical trials, we talk about, say, phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, but what does that actually mean? Starting, I suppose, with phase 1, what is a phase 1 trial?
Well, we might take a step back even further than that. The initial phase really is what are called preclinical trials. And that's where a drug is designed, and it may be tested in cell cultures, i.e. in a petri dish or something like that, or there might be animal studies. And these really are mainly looking at safety to make sure that the drug's not outright toxic, if you like. So if you use a drug in cell culture and it kills all the cells, or if you use animal studies, it kills all the rabbits, then you're not looking at, probably taking that forward to human trials. I'd have to say animal trials are probably less common than they used to be. Obviously, there's been, considerable feeling about using animals and in trials, and more these sort of trials now are conducted in cell culture. But anyway, that's the initial step in drug development. And then there are phase 1 trials. So phase 1 trials are really looking at the safety of the drug primarily. So in diseases like cancer, for example, that you might be treating patients, so particularly patients with advanced cancer where there are no really existing options for them, they might participate in a phase 1 trial. That might be their only hope. The other group in other drugs, for example, would be, just using normal healthy volunteers. I mean, to be frank with you, typically young students who do this because typically the volunteers do get paid for participation in these trials, and they're really looking at safety. They're looking at sort of things like drug absorption and drug elimination. So typically you have the drug, you have blood tests done at certain intervals to check for drug absorption, drug levels, and so on. And not uncommonly, volunteers in these studies sort of stay overnight and have observations taken for several days. So if that all goes well, then the next stage is a phase 2 trial. And that's, so I did mention that cancer patients, for example, can sometimes take part in phase 1 trials. It will be uncommon for things like ITP to be involved in phase 1 trials directly. So phase 2 trials are usually the earliest stage for most patients to be engaged in a trial. And these are really looking more at the effectiveness or the efficacy of drugs rather than the safety. And I've certainly done lots of phase 2 trials. So usually you've got some data suggesting a new drug might be very useful. It allows early access to those drugs. The safety's already been looked at and is found to be, adequate. So really, you're looking for the benefit in those trials. The advantage of phase 2 trials for patients, as well as, being able to get a drug access earlier than would otherwise be available, is that generally everyone gets drug on a phase 2 trial. And as we'll come on to later, that's not necessarily the case with phase 3 trials. So if you're on a phase 2 trial, there's less experience with using the drug. There's usually a fair bit of promise with what has already happened, but really it's to just ensure that, the drug does what it's supposed to do. And there's usually a component of working out what the best dose of drug will be moving forward to the next phase of trials. And that's phase 3. So phase 3 trial is usually a comparison of the new drug, the study drug, with the existing standard of care. So they're usually what are called randomized controlled trials. So typically 1 in 2 or 2 in 3 patients will get study drug, and either 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 will get placebo, which is an inactive drug. So you're comparing the drug against nothing. Or sometimes in phase 3 trials, you're comparing not against placebo, but existing standard of care. Either way, again, there's an opportunity to access new drugs, this time with a bit more evidence behind them, more likely to be effective, better safety data. But there is, as I say, that usually 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance that you may not actually get the study drug. So typically in these trials, you find that there is what's called a crossover in phase 3 trials. So subjects on the trial who didn't get the drug can cross over to the drug from placebo after a certain period of time, maybe a year, 6 months, something like that. So these trials are usually called double-blind trials. So neither the investigator, that's usually the doctor looking after you, nor the patient is supposed to know whether they're on drug or not. And that's important because increasingly and very importantly now, a lot of what are called patient-reported outcomes are measured, as well as sort of numbers like platelet counts and other sort of measured numbers in the laboratory. For example, patient-reported outcomes are often recorded, and obviously there's the tendency for biased reporting of symptoms. For example, if you know whether you're on a drug versus you know you're not on drug. So yeah, they're double blind. And then finally, there are what are called phase 4 trials. And phase 4 trials are when a drug's been licensed. So phase 3 trials, if they're successful, can be used as evidence to get drugs licensed with, in Australia, the TGA, in America, the FDA, and in Europe, the EMEA. They're the regulatory authorities. So phase 4 is beyond that registration, where you're looking for sort of rarer, longer term side effects, for example, that may not be apparent in when drugs are used in limited numbers of patients, that may only become apparent, in large scale use. So again, they're not really trials as such. They're more sort of post-marketing surveillance exercises by the drug companies and the regulatory authorities. So I think that's sort of that's an outline.
In Australia, obviously I mentioned there are quite a lot of clinical trials that are either active or recruiting at the moment, with a number of treatments coming down the pipeline as well that are about to sort of start clinical trial phases, etc. So with that in mind, if a patient was invited, if you were inviting a patient to join a clinical trial that you were running, what does that process look like for the patient?
Yeah, so look, I'd have to say about 20 years ago, it was kind of like, hey, I've got a clinical trial sign here. Absolutely, that's not the case anymore. So there used to be a very brief description of the trial, typically a page or page and a half. Now, if anyone who's been on a clinical trial will know, it's often a 30 to 50 page document called a PICF, or Patient Information and Consent Form, that really outlines in some detail the requirements of the study, potential problems that people might run into, what to do if people run into problems who are on the trial. It's a much more comprehensive information package. And there's really no realistic expectation that you can sit with someone in a consultation room, they can read through all that, understand it, and sign it, in a reasonable time frame. So typically what we do in clinical trials now is give people a copy of the PICF so that they can take it home, read it, make a few notes, look things up potentially, and come back and ask any questions before signing consent. So when we have a clinical trial, obviously we go through a process of putting in an expression of interest to the people running the trial. So there are different, it may be a drug company, it may be what's called a collaborative trial of just a group of local investigators, or it may be just an individual centre trial run by the investigator. But we typically, we're aware of the trial. We make colleagues aware, so that when people come in who might be eligible, we will give them an outline of the potential benefits and risks, and then provide them with this written information and some time to, research further, come back, ask questions. And once you've signed the consent form, there are all these things called eligibility criteria, and they are inclusion and exclusion criteria. So clinical trials have to be fairly rigorous on who they include, so that what you see in a clinical trial is a measured effect of having treatment with a given drug, for example. So you don't want people with a whole load of other illnesses that might influence their health over the next 3 or 4 months. You don't really want people who may need other treatments or surgery within a short time frame. You really want things to be as clean as possible, so that when you're looking at impacts the new treatment has, you're not having all these confusing factors coming in from the background. So those are controlled for and excluded. And that's why sometimes people think they might get on a clinical trial and they're in fact told, no, you can't. So typically things like hepatitis B, hep C, HIV would be exclusion criteria for most clinical trials. Very importantly, pregnancy and breastfeeding are exclusion criteria. So very, very seldom do pregnant women or women who are breastfeeding get included on clinical trials, except if they're specifically looking at things used in pregnancy. There are often an upper age limit and a lower age limit. So typically in Australia, it's, in adult hospitals, it's over 18s, i.e. people that can sign their own consent. And sometimes there's an upper age limit too. And to be honest with you, there's not always an incredibly robust reason for that. Again, I suppose it's just to keep things clean because, the older you get, the more likely you are to have other problems. But there is often an upper age limit that often seems to be fairly arbitrary.
Now, and with those informed consents or those information documents, a lot of the industry partners and the pharmaceutical companies are now starting to actually come to, patient associations like ourselves to review and to provide our own feedback as well. So, in some instances, we may have actually seen a lot of those informed consents and those documents well before, clinical trials sort of start, and it's really good that industry partners are actually starting to engage with us to get our feedback, I suppose, as well. So having that, and while I understand those documents are absolutely massive and it's a whirlwind of information, they are really important. They are a really important document to make sure that you are very aware of some of the likely risks or the potential risks, but also, these are some of the potential benefits as well. So with a clinical trial.
Thanks to our sponsor, Takeda, for their ongoing support of ITP Australia and New Zealand and our podcast, Beyond the Count.
What are some of the things that patients should carefully consider before taking part in a clinical trial? Outside of, I suppose, reading that document and asking those questions, what other, parts or other things should they be considering?
Yeah, look, I guess what I'd go by is I get a lot of patients referred for clinical trials, and often, before they come, they don't have a high level of awareness of what's going to be required. So one of the most common reasons people who think they might be interested in a clinical trial then change their mind is when they realise how much time or how many times they'll have to come up to the hospital, how long they'll have to stay. So typically with a clinical trial, especially one that's has a drug company sponsor, for example, typically people who participate will have all their expenses reimbursed, like travel expenses, parking, meals, etc. But I would have to say that there usually is more of a time commitment if you're on a clinical trial than if you're on just routine standard of care treatment. So, you might have to come weekly for the first, 6 weeks, and then fortnightly for a few visits, and then monthly. Typically you have to spend a bit more time coming to clinic if you're on a trial than if you're not on a trial. And sometimes, particularly if people have to travel, even though the expenses, if, for example, are taken care of, it's still a significant challenge in terms of time and, logistic considerations. So that's one reason people decline. The other reason is sometimes people who, they think, I'm coming for the new drug, and they don't realise that with, as we've mentioned, phase 3 trials, there is typically a 1 in 2 to a 1 in 3 chance you may not end up on drug. And people think, look, new treatment, that'll be great. But then they think, well, if I'm actually what I'm on at the moment, it's not too bad. And if I have to stop that to go on the clinical trial, which you sometimes do, you have to sometimes stop other medication to get on the trial. They think, well, I don't want to take the risk, if you like, of being on the inactive treatment or placebo arm. Sometimes, again, people are given a sort of very brief version of what the clinical trial involved. And when they read through the clinical trial documents, the patient information consent form, I think sometimes people are a bit overwhelmed by it. And the other thing you see is, if you're prescribed a new drug and you actually look up the product information, invariably every drug has a list of potential side effects that's as long as your arm. Yeah. And usually, for a drug to actually get registered or licensed or be on a clinical trial, usually there's a fair bit of safety data behind them. Well, invariably there is. Yeah. But it's very easy to be daunted by this massive list of potential side effects, and you think, my God, are they trying to poison me?
Yeah, exactly.
So again, sometimes people are just a bit overwhelmed with the amount of information and, a list of potential problems that might arise, even though, certainly as an investigator, I always weigh up very carefully, what I think the potential risks are versus the benefits of being on a trial for patients. So that those would be the things. The logistic requirements are often well in excess of what the standard would be for the illness that's being treated on the trial, i.e. ITP. Sometimes people don't like the idea, the chance they might not get on the drug. And sometimes it's just that, it's just overwhelming, the amount of information, and people just think, oh, no, or just stick with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Those are probably the three things that come up, reasons not, well, people who are initially interested then change their mind.
Yeah, no, and it is a big time commitment as well, because like you mentioned, it's not just about having to go into, clinic every week or every fortnight, every month. Is that you've got to commit to this for 2-3 years. Some clinical trials it's 5 years because of the follow-up period, and the follow-up period, especially that tail end, is it's once every 3 months or 6 months or whatever, but it is still classified as a time commitment. So, and this particular therapy, while it may not be approved in like right away for treatment, you're not necessarily just doing this for yourself. You're doing this for other patients as well.
Yeah, quite correct. That's an important consideration with the clinical trial. Sometimes there is clear benefit for the individual taking part of in the trial. And to be frank with you, frequently with diseases like ITP, with what's called an interventional trial, i.e., where you get a given treatment, then, I would say the vast majority of trials I've done in ITP, there's clear benefit for patients. But then, other trials are what's called observational trials, where there's no intervention or no change in treatment. You just, want to collect information on symptoms, for example, or some other sort of measure that you want to collect data on. And there's not likely to be any great deal of direct benefit to the people participating in the trial, but it might advance the kind of science in general for research and management of the disease.
And if a person is currently on a clinical trial and they find that drug is actually, or that therapy is actually working for them, once the clinical trial stops, what's the situation there? Do they, especially if it's not actually been approved?
Yeah, look, these days, almost invariably, as part of the trial contract, there will be an obligation for the sponsor of the trial. This is if it's a drug company, there will be an obligation for ongoing supply of the drug until it is commercially available in the country where the people live. So in Australia, that would mean it's basically on the PBS. So I've done, well, as you're well aware, I've done many clinical trials in ITP over the last 20 years. There have been some early phase trials, and there are trials where there was a defined period of treatment, like, for example, 3 or 4 IV infusions of a new drug, for example, that were thought to be potentially useful, where that's just been a defined period of treatment, no ongoing treatment. But more typically, with the sort of longer term oral medication trials, there's a guarantee of ongoing supply of drug for people who've derived benefit from drug until it's available to them, typically through the PBS.
Well, and that's always good to know too, because obviously if it does work for you and the trial ends, you want to make sure that you're still able to get access to that treatment. And in the ITP space, there's no guarantee that a treatment will actually work for you. So having that knowledge that you still have access to that treatment is really important, I think, as well.
But I guess there's just one little sort of caveat to that is just sometimes there are treatments that work for a few people, but not for the majority. Yeah. And what you often find in that situation is the drug development is stopped because essentially, the people making the drugs, they're for-profit companies. That they're there to keep their shareholders happy. That's the bottom line. And although they invest a huge amount in research and development, the bottom line is they want to turn a profit with their new drug. And sometimes individuals might benefit from a drug, but the population as a whole doesn't show much benefit, and then, as I say, drug development may be stopped. So in that case, it may be, it's relatively uncommon, but
it does happen.
Continued supply may not occur because the whole drug program stops. But typically, the most common scenario is that there will be ongoing drug supply on what's called a long-term extension program of the clinical trial, and then subsequently on an access program that will bridge the end of the trial to when the drug is available.
That's good.
Through PBS.
That's good to know.
Yep.
So we've talked a lot about, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, I talked about clinical trials having those physical outcomes. So for us in ITP, it's a platelet count. And that, I suppose that measure has changed a little bit as well. It's gone from, under 30 to, say 50, whereas now it's doubling of platelet counts or those sorts of things. But what about the non-platelet count measures that we look at in clinical trials, like the patient-reported outcomes you mentioned earlier, the mental health side, and the physical side?
Yeah, look, again, that's something that's hugely evolved over the past 20 years. So 20 years ago, there was very little regard given to patient-reported outcomes. Now it's pretty much, it's pretty much a requirement of any new clinical trial to collect patient-reported outcomes. So typically what you find is there'll be an app on your smartphone. So that's often an inclusion criterion for a clinical trial, is you have to have a smartphone so that you can get an app that you can report symptoms on, for example, every day or every week. So patient-reported outcomes very much come to the fore in clinical trials over the past few years, and are, up there, with platelet count in terms of response. So very much prioritized, whereas they weren't prioritized a few years ago. So really clinical trials are much more holistic now in their aims. It's not just a number you're looking to improve, you're looking to improve well-being of subjects on trial. So very, very, very much a focus of the modern clinical trial. And in fact, I'd almost go so far as to say that a clinical trial these days without any patient-reported outcomes would struggle to get up.
Yeah, very true, very true. And there have been quite a few, I suppose, clinical trials that have been reported on that have actually shown, reduction in fatigue by patients. Again, that is subjective from a patient perspective, but there have definitely been those outcomes that are actually starting to become part of the standard of care when it comes to clinical trials, which is absolutely excellent. And I think that while there's still plenty of improvement that can be done in that space, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction as well. So, and I suppose we're talking about mental health components and, those impacts. And we both, have known many patients that have not actually been eligible for a clinical trial, and, it was a bit of a hope for them that they'd get on a clinical trial, yet they are gutted, absolutely gutted from a mental health perspective. What sort of support systems, are there any support systems for people sort of in that situation that aren't actually eligible for a trial?
Look, I mean, technically, yes, there is availability of psychologists and psychiatrists, but I think it's, I don't think I'll be going too far out on a limb to say in the public sector, those, mental health services are very stretched. And to be frank with you, I think spend most of their time dealing with people with, very serious mental health problems, and probably don't have the time that they should do for people with what are personally very potentially disabling symptoms, but aren't going to put you in hospital, or aren't going to put you, aren't going to be picked up as disruptive, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can certainly, as a haematologist, absolutely, we can make referrals to psychology, to psychiatry services, but I don't have a huge level of expectation that everyone's needs would be met. To be frank, and look, peer support. That's where peer support from patient support organisations comes in. Really, in a large way to fill that gap. With rare diseases, you may not come into contact in the waiting room with many people with your disease. And I think, to have a bit of peer support and know you're not all by yourself, to know that there are other people on the same journey, can be reassuring. So, in many ways, I think, entities like ITP, Australia, New Zealand, while they're not specifically designed absolutely to fill that gap, they do to some extent help in areas where publicly funded services, sometimes fall short.
And that's one of the things I think that I'd like everyone to remember as well, is that a number of us have actually been on clinical trials, so we sort of get what you're going through and some of the ups and the downs and some of the challenges as well. So, and we're always available to catch up with and to talk to. So if you are looking for specific clinical trial, connection or a buddy or someone just to talk to, feel free to reach out to us. It's what we're here for. We're always got an ear open, ready to listen and to help support you guys as well, which I think is really important.
The other thing I've noticed is often, so when you're on a clinical trial, you have an investigator, which is the doctor.
Yep.
You have trial nurses and you have trial coordinators.
Yep.
And what you'll often find is a patient and their doctor have a certain relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think the patient feels a really high level of responsibility to keep the doctor happy. And often won't reveal, often won't, when they come to see the doctor, everything's fine. And then you find out later that they've told the nurses and the trial coordinators that everything isn't fine.
Yeah.
And I guess, speaking to a middle-aged bloke's one thing, speaking to, a lot of the trial coordinators are female, male and female. Most of the nurses are female, but they're both male and female. But I guess it's, just have a sort of different relationship, really. And you do often find, after people have gone, you get a sort of knock on the door and they say, oh, did Mrs. X tell you that she's, not doing so well? And you say, no,
not at all. Yeah.
And so, you find out sort of, that's another thing I guess we haven't said with clinical trials. There's a bit of a team involved. It's not just the investigator and the patient on the trial. There is that coordinator who people generally develop quite a strong relationship with, and there are trial nurses as well who are involved. So, and usually if there's a problem, in between visits, that the trial coordinator will be the first point of contact. And then, they will, absolutely definitely escalate any problems to the investigator or the doctor if required. But, often it's things like logistics and they're, like travel to and from, and they're the people that can most quickly sort that out rather than the doctor anyway. So,
exactly. And it's a team, it's a village that that run these trials, and you become like a little community as well. So I think it's really important, and it's important from an ITP space as well, because ITP is so rare, and while we say that we've got a lot of clinical trials running, we have to remember that we're a finite number of patients, and then, and only a small percentage of patients actually participate in trials as well. So that number, it gets even smaller. And then right across the country, if there's 4 or 5 trial sites, that number becomes even smaller within that care team. So, making sure that you talk to them and, work with them, and they're there to be lent on, and definitely lean on them, definitely utilise them where you need to as well. Okay, so how can patients decide if they want to start a clinical trial, and if a particular clinical trial is right for them?
Yeah, really that's down to the discussion. So obviously it's important to read through the information. Obviously, do your own research. And really, it's important to ask the doctor that's running the trial. They'll give you a frank view. I mean, in all honesty, I've told some people that clinical trials, I don't think there's going to be a lot in it for you personally, but what you'd be doing for other people with the disease or patients in the future. So, none of us have a sort of financial interest in the success of trials. Well, if we do, we shouldn't be doing them.
Exactly.
So it's really about having a frank discussion with your treating doctor. If you're being so commonly, I get patients referred for trials who have previously been treated by another haematologist. They've generally recommended the trial, sent the person to me. But it's really about having, really being absolutely open about any concerns you have about being on the trial, really asking specifically about what the potential benefits might be. Just really to be, the process of getting on a clinical trial is called informed consent. And the important thing about informed consent is it's not a signature on a piece of paper. It is really, informed consent means you know exactly what you're getting into before you agree to get into it. And, that is very much the doctor's responsibility to try to make sure that, the patient is really knows what they're doing. The other thing I always recommend is that when people come to clinic for these sorts of decisions, they bring a support person. That's usually a family member, or if family member's not available, a good friend. So if you like, a second set of ears, and someone that you as a patient give permission to ask questions, so that if the doctor's kind of trying to pull the wool over your eyes, you've got a bit of a backup in your corner.
Yeah.
I don't think, look, under ideal circumstances, the doctor absolutely wouldn't be trying to pull the wool over your eyes. But,
No.
it is important. The other thing you can do, if you want to, and I would never disagree with a request to do this, is you can record a conversation if you want to listen to it afterwards, but you do have to ask permission to do that. But yeah, a second set of ears in the room, and particularly, if someone's got what we call a high level of health literacy, that is someone who has got a good understanding of health things. So, typically people don't bring their grandma. Typically people bring an adult child or a spouse or, just someone that that they've got a high level of trust in, who's, a clear thinker, who can come and help with the decisions and help with the questions. So that, really, you've got truly informed consent before deciding to sign up for a trial.
Yeah. And when it comes to informed consent as well, if you're in a trial and, everybody wants the trial to be successful, but at the end of the day, if you decide that you need to pull the pin at any time, you can pull the pin. It's a bit of a process, but know that when you do sign up for this trial, even especially early, if it's not right for you, you can, pull out of that particular clinical trial as well. I don't encourage it, but it's, if circumstances change, something happens down the track and you're not feeling comfortable or whatever, know that there is also that option as well. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And the treating doctor has got an obligation to, give you the best possible care. Certainly you'd never hold it against someone.
No.
You can withdraw for a clinical trial without giving a reason. Absolutely. And that certainly wouldn't compromise your relationship with your treating doctor or the hospital or anyone else.
No, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, there's definitely no black star or, anything like that against your name for something like that. So know that that is also an option as well. So, and it takes some time to really decide and, weigh up the pros and the cons. Like you said, have a chat with that you trust that may have a high health literacy as well, so they can understand from a lifestyle perspective how this is going to impact you as well. You and your family unit is also is a potential. So making sure that you go in completely open-minded with all of the information. Well, I think that's it. That's a lot of information to digest, I think, for a lot of people. So we might leave that there. We will definitely incorporate this into our next edition of The Count as well. So make sure you keep an eye out for the next edition of the magazine, because it is definitely something that's really important. And to learn about what clinical trials are available in Australia, jump on our website. We have an up-to-date register ready to go with all of the details, including details on sites and what the clinical trials are, and we get all of that information from trusted sources as well. So make sure you jump online to itpanz.org.au and check out the clinical trial section. But thank you so much, Rob, for joining us today. It's definitely been informative. I've definitely learned a couple of things as well, which is exciting, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, thanks very much, Danielle, and thanks for everyone for paying attention.
I hope you all got a lot out of today's episode. Before we wrap up, here are 5 key takeaways from our conversation with Dr. Robert Bird. Number 1, clinical trials are designed to test new treatments for conditions like ITP in a safe and structured environment. Take the time to understand the purpose, process and phase of the trial before making a decision. Number 2, ask about ITP treatment options and alternatives. Before joining a trial, speak with your haematologist about standard of care, your treatment options, and how these trials compare to those treatments. Number 3, not everyone will qualify for every clinical trial. Trial eligibility will depend on the number of factors, including how long you've had ITP, your treatment history, overall medical history, and more. Number 4, clinical trials can involve frequent visits, travel, and a long-term commitment. Make sure this fits in with your lifestyle and your support network. Number 5, know your rights as a patient. You can always withdraw from a clinical trial at any time. Participation is always your choice and your care will not be compromised. A special thank you to Dr. Robert Bird for sharing his expertise and helping us break down clinical trials, and for his ongoing commitment to the ITP community. If you're looking for support, connection or information, visit itpanz.org.au. You'll find The Count, our quarterly magazine, patient stories, treatment information sheets, clinical guidelines and a wide range of resources designed to help you and your family feel informed and supported. Most importantly, you'll know that you're not alone. There's a whole community here just waiting for you. If this episode was helpful, please share it with others in the ITP community and leave us a review on your podcast platform. It helps more people find Beyond the Count. We've got more expert conversations, patient stories and more coming soon. So hit the follow or subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for listening as we go beyond the count together.